In the forgotten pages of America's past lies a story so shocking, it destroyed an entire family name. A powerful general, admired by all, made a choice no man should ever make. He traded his own wife for power. This secret pact would shatter his dynasty and leave a dark scar on history. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's a warning. And if you love uncovering hidden American stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. America in the early 1800s was a nation caught between two worlds. On one hand, it was young, raw, and hungry. The revolution had been won, independence declared, and the great promise of liberty seemed to shine across the land. On the other hand, beneath that bright surface, the old order of wealth, power, and social hierarchies still ruled daily life. This was a time when a man's worth was measured not just by his character, but by the land he owned, the slaves he commanded, and the respect he demanded. A general, a colonel, or a wealthy planter could rise to heights of power that seemed untouchable. And once a man had climbed that high, he was expected never to fall. The great families of the South and along the frontier built their legacies on land thousands of acres stretching as far as the eye could see. Their houses stood tall and proud, built not only as homes, but as monuments to their ambition. The white pillars, the sprawling porches, the fields filled with labor, these were more than possessions. They were symbols of dominance. At church on Sunday, these men and their wives would sit in the front pews, their presence commanding attention. They lived as if they were untouchable, their names whispered with respect, their reputations guarded with almost sacred care. For in those years, reputation was everything. Behind this surface of honor, however, life was far from pure. Wealthy households often carried dark secrets. Slavery itself was the great hypocrisy of the new nation America, declared freedom, yet millions remained in bondage. In the grand houses of the South, the lives of the enslaved and the lives of their masters were tied together, bound by cruelty, silence, and power. Everyone knew it, but few dared to speak it aloud. In such a world, the men who held titles of general or colonel were not simply soldiers, they were rulers of small kingdoms. Their voices carried weight in politics, their alliances shaped communities, and their choices could determine whether a family thrived or was ruined. A man in such a position had influence, but influence was never enough. He always wanted more, and this hunger for more was not unusual. In fact, it was expected. America was expanding, pushing its borders westward, swallowing new territories, and planting new flags. To fall behind in ambition was to be forgotten. To be remembered, a man had to be ruthless. For women in this world, life was defined by silence and duty. A wife was more than a companion. She was a reflection of her husband's honor. She was expected to embody dignity, grace, and obedience. Her reputation, her beauty, even her very loyalty were considered extensions of her husband's power. A scandal attached to her was a scandal attached to him. And so, women were often trapped in marriages that were less about love and more about survival, prestige, and the preservation of family names. It was in this setting that our general built his life. He was no common soldier. He was admired, decorated, respected. His presence filled rooms, and his voice could rally men to action. He had fought for his name, earned land for his family, and secured a place among the powerful elite of his community. To outsiders, he seemed like a man who had everything: a loyal wife, children who carried his bloodline, and a reputation carved in stone. But if history teaches us anything, it is that appearances can be deceiving. The higher a man climbs, the deeper his fall will be. And behind the polished doors of his home, the general carried a hunger that could never be satisfied. Power to him was not just a tool, it was a religion. And like many men who worship power, he was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to keep it in the fragile world of early America, where honor was currency and whispers of scandal could spread like wildfire. One decision could unravel an entire dynasty. A man could spend decades building his name, yet watch it destroyed in a single night of betrayal. This was the world in which the general made his choice. A world where men valued their reputation above their own souls, where women were caught in the crossfire of ambition, and where the enslaved carried silent knowledge of the sins their masters hoped would never see the light of day. The America of the early 1800s was a place of promise. Yes, but it was also a place of secrets buried in family estates, secrets whispered in slave quarters, secrets that lived in the shadows of wealth and honor. And it was within this fragile, dangerous balance that the general's fateful agreement was born. He believed he could control it, just as he had controlled every other aspect of his life. He believed the pact he made would remain hidden, that his power would shield him from the judgment of others. But history has a way of revealing the truth, no matter how carefully men tried to bury it. And so, in this young nation still learning to define its identity, a single man's hunger for more would lead him to commit an act so unthinkable, so shameful, that it would shatter not only his family, but the very legacy he hoped to leave behind. The story of the general does not begin with the pact itself. It begins here, in this world of ambition and silence, of honor and hypocrisy. It begins in a land where the weight of reputation was heavier than chains, and where a man's choices could echo through generations. This was America, and a land of glory on the surface, but shadows just beneath. And into those shadows the general stepped willingly, believing he could command even the darkness. He was wrong. Asterisk. The man at the center of this story was not born into greatness. Like many of his generation, he was shaped by hardship, ambition, and the restless spirit of a nation still defining itself. He grew up in a household where discipline was strict, where work was constant, and where honor was spoken of as though it were life itself. As a boy, he watched older men gather around fires and speak of the revolution, of the sacrifices that built America. He learned that a man's duty was not only to his family, but to his country, and that courage in battle could lift a man from obscurity into glory. Those lessons stayed with him, etched into his heart like scripture. When he was old enough, he did what so many young men of that era longed to do. He enlisted. The army became his world. It was there that he learned to command, to obey, to survive. He carried himself with a seriousness that drew attention. He was not reckless. He was deliberate. He measured his words, planned his moves, and showed a hunger to lead that few could ignore. War gave him opportunity. Skirmishes, campaigns, and the grinding discipline of army life hardened him. He earned the respect of his men, not by charm, but by presence. He stood tall, eyes sharp, his posture unshaken, even when the air filled with gunpowder. Officers took note. Superiors marked his name. And slowly, step by step, he rose through the ranks until he bore the title of general. For him, this was not just a promotion. It was a coronation. In his mind, he had stepped into the role he was destined to play. No longer was he a boy from a modest home. Now, he was a man whose word carried weight, whose uniform demanded respect, whose very presence made people stand straighter. Yet for all his military triumphs, the general knew that battles alone could not secure his legacy. America was shifting. The true power lay not just on the battlefield, but in the ownership of land, in the wealth of estates, in the alliances formed through marriage and influence. To build a dynasty, a man needed more than a sword. He needed land, wealth, and a family name that would echo through generations. It was at this point in his rise that he found her, his wife. She was the daughter of a respected family, raised in refinement, graceful in manner, admired for both her beauty and her quiet strength. To the world, she was the perfect lady. To him, she was more than a partner, she was a symbol. In marrying her, he did not just gain a wife. He gained stature. Their union was a joining of ambitions, a consolidation of honor that in public they shone. They attended gatherings where their names were spoken with admiration. Their household became a place of influence, where decisions were made and alliances forged. The general carried himself as though he were untouchable, and with his wife at his side, he seemed to embody the very picture of success. Behind closed doors, however, the demands of ambition weighed heavily. He was not a man content with what he had. Every victory only sharpened his hunger for the next. Every whisper of respect only left him craving louder praise. His wife often saw the shadows in his eyes, the way his mind wandered when he should have been at ease. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the man she had married was not driven by peace or love. He was driven by the endless pursuit of more dot in their home. Discipline ruled. Servants and slaves moved with quiet efficiency, careful never to cross him. The children learned early that their father's word was law. He demanded perfection, obedience, respect. And though he rarely raised his voice, his presence alone carried a weight that silenced those around him. Neighbors respected him. Some feared him. Many envied him. He seemed to have it all. A rising name in politics, vast acres of land, wealth that grew with each passing year, and a family that mirrored his ambition. He was invited into the highest circles of influence, his counsel sought after, his opinions valued. To many, he was the very model of the American dream, a man who had climbed from modest beginnings to stand at the peak of power. But the higher a man climbs, the more fragile his position becomes. And the general knew it. His fortune, his influence, his reputation, all of it rested on a delicate balance. One whisper of scandal, one misstep in politics, one betrayal could unravel everything he had built. This fear haunted him, even as he smiled in public and shook hands with confidence. And so, he guarded his reputation like a soldier guards his weapon. Every action was calculated, every word chosen carefully, every alliance considered with strategy. He was a man who thought in terms of battles, even in his personal life, always watching for enemies, always preparing for the next move. Yet even with his vigilance, cracks began to show. Some whispered that his ambition outpaced his honor. Others noticed the strain in his household. The way his wife's smile seemed more practiced than genuine. And among those who lived under his roof, the enslaved who saw everything, there were eyes that noticed the truth he tried to conceal, the truth that power had become his obsession, and that he would do anything to keep it. The general had risen higher than most men ever could. He had built a life that appeared unshakable. But the same ambition that lifted him up would soon lead him into a decision so dark, so unthinkable, that it would undo everything he had worked for. The rise of the general was impressive, but it was only the beginning of a story that would end in ruin. For the greater the rise, the greater the fall. And the pact he was about to make would ensure that his name, once spoken with respect, would instead be remembered with shame. Every rise in history comes with a moment of choice, a line where ambition crosses into betrayal. For the general, that moment arrived quietly, without drums or gunfire, in the stillness of his own home. By the time he reached the height of his influence, he had gathered much of what men of his age desired: land, wealth, recognition. But for him, it was never enough. He sought not just influence in his community, but dominance. He wanted his name to be spoken in the halls of politics, in the backrooms where power was truly decided. He wanted his dynasty to be untouchable, but power in America during those years was built on bargains. A man could not climb alone. He needed allies, men of equal or greater power, who demanded something in return for their loyalty. Some demanded money, others land, others promises of votes and support. But the demand placed upon the general was unlike anything he had faced before. At first, it seemed impossible, unthinkable. The very suggestion filled him with fury. Yet the longer he considered it, the more it took root in his mind. The pact was this: in exchange for protection of his reputation, for greater wealth, for political influence that would secure his place among the most powerful men of his age, he would surrender the one thing no husband should ever give his wife. The arrangement was not written down, not spoken of in the open. It lived in whispers, in handshakes exchanged behind closed doors, in nights when the general's wife vanished into silence and returned with eyes that no longer glowed as they once had. Imagined her once the jewel of his household, admired by neighbors for her dignity and grace, now reduced to a bargaining chip in her husband's hunger for power. She did not agree, not truly. How could she? But in a world where women had little voice, her refusal meant nothing. The general's word was law, and his ambition was iron. For the enslaved in his home, the truth was unavoidable. They saw what others pretended not to see. They noticed her absence, heard the muffled tears, carried the weight of secrets they dared never speak aloud. History often tells the stories of generals and kings, but it is the quiet witnesses who bear the heaviest burdens. And in this case, the enslaved carried the knowledge of a pact so foul it poisoned the walls of the estate itself. The general convinced himself it was necessary. He told himself it was for the good of his children, for the future of his dynasty. He clothed his betrayal in the language of duty, as though ambition could ever excuse such treachery. In truth, it was not duty, but pride. He could not stand the thought of slipping from power, of being overshadowed, of losing the respect he had clawed his way to earn. And so, the agreement was made. From that moment, the house was never the same. His wife moved like a shadow of herself. She fulfilled her duties, attended gatherings, played the role expected of her, but her spirit had been broken. Neighbors began to whisper about her frailty, her silence, the way her once bright smile faded into something distant and hollow. The general, too, was changed. Outwardly, he remained commanding, ambitious, larger than life. But behind his eyes lived a darkness he could not shake. He had crossed a line, and though he pretended otherwise, he knew it. He had gained influence, yes, but it came at the cost of his honor, and deep down he felt the stain of it. Rumors began to spread. At first, they were faint hushed conversations in taverns, subtle glances at church, whispers exchanged among the enslaved who knew more than they could ever reveal. Then the stories grew bolder. The general, people murmured, has traded his own wife. It was said with disbelief, with disgust, with shame. Few knew the details, but the whispers were enough. And in a world where reputation was everything, whispers could be as deadly as bullets. His children, though young, felt the weight of it too. They heard the murmurs. They saw the way neighbors looked at their mother with pity and their father with hidden scorn. Though the truth was never spoken plainly to them, they understood. Children always do. The household that once seemed so unshakable now carried the stench of disgrace. The enslaved, bound to the house yet powerless to act, held the secret like a curse. To them, the general was not just a master, but a man stripped of humanity, a man willing to destroy his own family for the sake of influence. They saw his wife not as a lady of the house, but as a victim trapped in a cage far crueler than chains. For the general, each new alliance gained through his pact was a hollow victory. He gained the wealth, the support, the political backing he sought. His voice carried further than ever before. His name appeared in circles he once only dreamed of entering. Yet every triumph tasted of ash. Every time he looked upon his wife, every time he saw the emptiness in her eyes, he was reminded of the price he had paid. And so, the pact that was supposed to secure his dynasty instead began to unravel it. For a man may gain the world, but if he loses his soul, what is left? The dark agreement was more than a betrayal of his wife. It was a betrayal of the very ideals America claimed to cherish: honor, dignity, family, freedom. And though the general tried to bury it in silence, though he tried to cover it with wealth and power, history has a way of dragging such sins into the light. What he believed would strengthen his name would instead destroy it. What he thought would secure his family's future would instead doom it. This was the turning point. This was the choice that took a respected general and turned him into a cautionary tale. From this moment forward, his legacy was not built on his victories in battle, nor his influence in politics, but on the shame of a pact that no man should ever make. The agreement that promised him power had instead become the crack in the foundation of his dynasty. And soon, the weight of that crack would bring the entire house down. The walls of a house remember everything. They remember laughter and joy, but they also remember silence, sorrow, and the weight of secrets too heavy to speak. After the general made his pact, the walls of his estate seemed to close in on the family, holding inside a grief that could not be hidden forever. His wife, once admired for her grace, became a different woman. Before, she had been a figure of quiet strength. She managed the household with dignity, welcomed neighbors with warmth, and carried herself as the symbol of her husband's honor. But after the agreement, her eyes no longer carried the same light. She moved like someone half alive, fulfilling her duties because she must, not because she wished to dot at gatherings. People began to notice. Where she once laughed softly at conversation, now she remained silent. Where her presence once drew admiration, now it drew pity. Some whispered that she had fallen ill. Others guessed at troubles inside the marriage. None spoke openly, for to accuse a general of dishonor was dangerous. But the whispers grew, and the shame spread like smoke. Inside the home, the children felt it most. A child's heart can sense sorrow, even when no words explain it. They saw their mother's distant stare, her sudden tears, her forced smiles. They saw their father's sternness grow heavier, his silences more frequent. They knew something had changed, though they did not know the details. And children, left in silence, imagined far worse than the truth. The general himself carried on as though nothing had happened. He appeared at public events with his wife at his side, their children dressed neatly, their image carefully preserved. To the world, he tried to project strength. But strength cannot hide the cracks forever. Behind closed doors, the tension was unbearable. His wife no longer looked at him with love. She looked at him with quiet grief, as though the man she had married was gone, replaced by someone colder. Someone capable of betrayal she had never thought possible. The enslaved in the household bore witness to it all. They carried trays of food into rooms heavy with silence. They tended to children who asked questions no one dared answer. They saw the lady of the house retreat into herself. Day after day, her spirit dimming like a candle running out of wax. They knew the truth of the general's pact, and though they could not speak it aloud, they carried that knowledge, like a wound of their own. In the town, rumors became stronger. The general traded his wife, people murmured, careful to lower their voices. Some dismissed it as slander. Others, with eyes sharpened by observation, believed it. They saw too much sorrow in the wife's face, too much pride in the general's manner. They suspected, and suspicion is sometimes more powerful than proof. The family name, once spoken with admiration, became a name of curiosity. People wondered what went on inside that grand house. Children whispered to one another. Women glanced at the wife with pity. Men shook their heads when the general's back was turned. The dynasty he had worked so hard to build was already beginning to crumble, not by war or poverty, but by whispers of disgrace. His wife carried the deepest wound. She had been given, not by her own choice, to fulfill her husband's hunger for influence. She lived each day knowing she was no longer a partner, but a possession bartered away. Her dignity was stripped, and though she carried herself with the same outward composure, inside she was broken. There is no greater betrayal a woman can endure than to be sacrificed by the man she trusted most. For the children, her pain became their inheritance. They grew up under the shadow of shame, sensing the fracture in their household, watching their mother fade while their father pressed forward with cold ambition. Some grew bitter, others silent, but none could escape the truth that their family, once held up as an example of success, was marked by disgrace. And for the general, outwardly he appeared unchanged. He still shook hands firmly, still commanded respect, still maneuvered in politics with skill. But behind his stern face, he carried the weight of what he had done. Though he would never admit it, not even to himself. He knew he had lost something greater than land or wealth. He had lost the trust of those closest to him. No empire, no dynasty, no name can stand when it is built on betrayal. The walls of his house, the eyes of his children, the silence of his wife, all bore witness against him. And though the general still walked with his head high, the foundation beneath him had already begun to crack. In time, the whispers would grow louder. The shame would spread further. And the pact, which he believed would secure his future, would instead destroy everything he held dear. The family, once whole, was shattered. And the cracks would only deepen until the dynasty itself collapsed. Every secret, no matter how carefully buried, eventually rises to the surface. For the general, the day came when whispers grew louder than respect, when shame shadowed him even in the public square. What began as hushed talk in the corners of taverns and parlors soon reached the ears of men in power, men who once supported him but now questioned whether they could trust him. In America's old communities, reputation was everything. A man's word, his family, his honor, these were the pillars that sustained influence. Without them, no wealth or land could hold a dynasty together. The general had underestimated this truth. He had traded honor for advantage, thinking no one would ever know the price. But people did know. And once suspicion touched his name, it spread like fire through dry fields. Neighbors who once tipped their hats to him now looked away. Women in the town pitied his wife, though most were too polite to speak of it openly. Young men, once eager to serve under him, began to whisper that his leadership was not as noble as it seemed. The general could feel the shift everywhere he went. Doors that had always been open to him began to close. Invitations grew fewer. All eyes drifted, one by one. His political ambitions suffered first. Rivals seized upon the rumors, fanning them like embers into flame. Can a man who betrays his own household be trusted with the affairs of a nation? They asked. It was not spoken in public speeches, but it spread in private letters, in backroom conversations, in the kind of talk that ruins reputations without ever naming names. Soon, supporters turned cautious, unwilling to risk their own names being tied to his. Business, too, began to falter. Partnerships dissolved quietly. Men who once sought his counsel now sought distance. Even those who did not believe the worst of the story believed enough of it to doubt. And in business, doubt is poison. But perhaps the most painful loss was in the military circles where he had once been admired. Younger officers who had looked up to him began to question whether his rise had been due to merit or manipulation. His decisions were scrutinized, his motives doubted. Once a symbol of discipline and honor, he now bore the invisible mark of disgrace. At home, the decline was even more devastating. His children, now older, could no longer be shielded from the truth. They heard the whispers in town. They saw the looks cast toward their mother. They knew their father had made a choice that left scars not only on her, but on them as well. Resentment grew, quiet but heavy, between father and children. A family cannot thrive in silence when the silence is poisoned by betrayal. His wife, though still present in the home, seemed more like a shadow than a partner. She carried her sorrow with dignity, but the distance between them was plain to all who saw. What once had been a home of pride and respect became a place of cold formality, where duty replaced love and appearances replaced truth. The dynasty itself, the family name he had once sought to elevate, now bore the stain of scandal. When people spoke of him, they no longer spoke of his victories or his influence. They spoke of the Pact. Some told the story with outrage, others with pity, but all told it. And in the telling, the legacy he had worked so hard to build unraveled. There is a strange justice in history. Sometimes a man can conquer armies, accumulate wealth, and stand at the highest peak of society, yet lose everything because of a single choice of the heart. The general believed he had secured power, but in truth, he had destroyed the very foundation that gave power meaning. By the end, he was a man surrounded by walls, but without allies. A man with land, but without respect. A man with a family, but without love. His dynasty had fallen, not through battle or bankruptcy, but through betrayal. And betrayal leaves ruins no fire can erase. The general's story became a warning, repeated quietly by those who remembered. A warning that no pact, no advantage, no ambition is worth the cost of honor. Because once honor is lost, everything else eventually follows. And for him, everything did. History often remembers the battles fought and the lands conquered, but it rarely forgets the choices that betray the human heart. The general, who once commanded armies and wielded influence like a king, became remembered not for his victories, but for the shadow his ambition cast upon those closest to him. Power, he learned too late, comes at a cost. It can build empires, yes, but it can also destroy families. The pact he made, traded for wealth and influence, left scars that no amount of land or prestige could heal. His wife, once the bright soul of his household, carried the memory of betrayal until the end of her days. His children grew up in a house where silence replaced love and whispers replaced warmth. And the society that once admired him now remembered him as a cautionary tale. America itself was young then, grappling with its ideals of freedom and equality, while still bound by traditions and hierarchy. The general's story mirrors that struggle. A nation pursuing greatness, yet often paying the price for ambition unchecked. His personal tragedy was a reflection of a broader truth that honor and integrity are as important as any sword, any vote, or any title. For the families who survived scandals and whispers, history teaches patience and resilience. For those who seek influence, it teaches humility. And for those who study the past, it reminds us that human hearts, like nations, are fragile when ambition outweighs conscience. The general's name faded in the official records. Newspapers mentioned him rarely, and when they did, it was not for heroism but for caution. Yet, in the quiet corners of history, in the letters, the diaries, and the stories passed from one generation to another, his tale endured. It endured as a warning, a lesson, and a reminder that the pursuit of power without honor leaves nothing behind but sorrow. And perhaps that is the truest legacy. A man can leave a story that warns, that teaches, that compels future generations to remember that some victories are not worth the price. The general may have lost everything he sought: love, family, respect, but his story survives, etched into the memory of America's past, a somber echo of ambition gone too far. The story of the general is a story of ambition, betrayal, and the cost of unchecked desire. It is a story that reminds us that power, no matter how great, can never replace love, honor, or family. He gained influence, wealth, and status, yet lost the most precious things a man can hold: trust, respect, and the hearts of those closest to him dot in the quiet corners of history. His name is remembered not for victories on the battlefield, but for the choices that shattered a family and left a dynasty in ruins. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all, that the pursuit of greatness without conscience carries consequences that echo across generations. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the weight of ambition and the fragility of honor, then make sure you join us on this journey through America's hidden past. Hit that like button, share this story with friends who love history, and subscribe so you never miss the forgotten tales that shaped this nation. History is full of lessons, waiting for those who will listen. And together, we can keep these stories alive, ensuring that the choices, the triumphs, and the tragedies of America's past are never forgotten.